Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Denise Amber Lee was a 21-year-old happily married mother of 2 little boys. She had her whole life ahead of her, until an intruder broke into her Florida home. Within a few short hours, she was savagely terrorized and murdered. Michael King, a 38-year-old out-of-work plumber, was a ticking time bomb. Incredibly, Denise managed to call 911 twice during her abduction. Eyewitness and her distraught husband also called, but a slow, inefficient system tragically failed her. King was sentenced to death, but for Denise and her loving family, it was too late. The book that we're featuring this evening is A Killer's Touch, with my special guest, journalist and author, Michael Benson. Thank you for agreeing to this program, and welcome back to the True Murder, Michael Benson.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dan.
Thank you very much, Michael. Great book, by the way. I'm sure the audience is looking forward to this interview. It's a very different story. We'll get right into it right now. For our audience, let's go back to where this takes place in Northport. Describe the area where this crime goes down, and then please let's go backwards and also talk first about Denise Amber Lee, and then we can talk about Michael King.
Sure. The story takes place in Northport, Florida. It's a town outside of Sarasota. It had originally been a small village surrounded by farms, but it built up into a sprawling suburb with lots of tract housing. Population grew not just because people moved there permanently, but also because it was a popular destination for snowbirds, folks who lived up north in the summer and then lived in Florida during the winter. Right. Northport had grown so rapidly that it really real estate people overestimated its popularity. When the real estate market dropped, they continued to build houses. And what happened was there were more houses than there were people, and you had housing tracts that were only partially occupied, and that was the neighborhood where the Lees lived. So it was an area that 50 years before had been virtually crime-free, and now it was an area plagued by burglaries.
Okay.
Now, Denise, her name was Denise Amber Lee. She grew up as Denise Goff. She was, as you said, 21-year-old mother of 2 little boys, lived on Latour Avenue. The housing tract was only partially occupied. She was a beautiful blonde. She liked to walk around her house wearing a T-shirt and her husband's boxer shorts. And her husband had asked her repeatedly, keep the blinds closed when you dress like that. And she always said, well, why? It's hot out and there's nobody on the street anyway. Nobody's going to look in. She'd been a good student, smart girl, had attended some college. She met and fell in love with her husband, Nate Lee, while they were still in high school, and they started a very adult life at a very young age, 2 kids at the age of 21. Nate was working 3 jobs, along with being a musician in the local Philharmonic Orchestra. Also, Denise could stay home and take care of the babies, which was quite a job in itself because they were both in diapers. And Nate was working as a meter reader when this happened, and he knew something was wrong well before he arrived home. He'd called 8 times on his cell phone while in his car and was deeply distressed by the fact that Denise wasn't answering her phone.
Okay, let's go back to the actual, that day that we're talking about is January 17th, 2008. But before we do that, let's get to the character of Michael King. Very much unlike your book, let's get the character of Michael King so that we know, because this person is late in life killer here. So he's either 38 or 36. I got conflicting. I'm not quite sure of the
I
age.
believe he was 30. I have 37.
Okay, there we go. We'll go in between that. Okay, so tell us about Michael King before we get to January 17, 2008.
Well, I think Michael King would have been a notorious killer if he hadn't been caught so quickly after his crime spree started. And the reason he was caught as quickly as he was because he picked the wrong victim. I mean, Denise Lee was a cop's daughter, and she was smart, and he wasn't. He grew up in Michigan, not terribly bright fellow, and for years he'd made a living as a handyman and a plumber. But for the last couple of years, things had been on the downturn for him. In 2008, when this happened, his life was getting to be a bit of a mess. He was divorced, he had custody of a son he couldn't afford. He was dating a series of small blonde women. He had a type. All of his girlfriends looked alike. They're small blonde women, and some of them were also crippled by dysfunction. So it was getting harder and harder for him to find work. He was facing foreclosure on his Northport home, which had already been emptied of furniture by one of his exes. He was angry at the women he dated. He didn't have a criminal history, but when the monster within him emerged, it came out big time. You know, his financial worries and his girlfriend troubles combined into an intense anger with a strong sexual component. And in frustration, he decided he was going to steal a woman and take what he wanted. As it turned out, boy, did he ever pick the wrong woman.
Right.
Let me tell you about...
yeah, tell us about January 17, 2008. Yeah. You just tell it. Denise was... Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, Denise is home alone with her kids. She's giving one of her boys a haircut. Dressed, in men's underwear, which was her choice on hot days. And it was dark and drizzly, kind of a gray day. And Michael King was driving his green Camaro up and down Latour Avenue looking for a victim. And next door to the Lee's house, there was a woman named Jennifer Eckert, who was also a tiny blonde woman, and she was waiting for her boyfriend to pick her up. She looked out the front window and, wondered what this guy in the car was up to. It's going back and forth, back and forth. And at one point, she even went outside thinking the guy might be lost and in need of directions.
Wow. But
for some reason, the man in the car did not want Jennifer. He pulled into the next-door neighbor's park driveway instead. And so maybe he saw her through the living room window, just as Nate had warned her about. We don't know. We don't know when it made him stop. But the car crawled into the Lee driveway very slowly, and Jennifer went back to watching TV. The next thing she knows, it's a few minutes later, and the car is burning rubber down the street. The guy completely peeled out like a bat out of hell. He arrives going very slowly and leaves going very fast. Now, Jennifer turned out to be a very important witness because as soon as police were informed that there was a woman missing, Jennifer was able to give them a description of the suspicious car and its driver. And when Nate Lee came home and found Denise gone, he didn't call 911 first. He called his father-in-law, Rick, who was a police sergeant in nearby Charlotte County. And if the victim had been anyone else, there might have been a delay in the search because police would have been questioning Nate. When something bad happens to a married person, the spouse is always the first suspect.
Right.
And, in other cases, police may assume that there had been an argument, the wife simply ran off and might be back soon. But in this case, because the victim's father was a cop, the search for her started right away, and within minutes of the call, that Denise was missing, there were canine teams out and helicopters joining the search. Now,
can you tell us a little bit about what I found interesting too? Is it's just a little bit more of Nate finding what he did find. He talked to his wife at 11 something in the morning anyway, and he came home at 3:30. He had told her open the windows, get some fresh air. He came home, the windows were all closed. And what did he find in the home that was?
Well, he finds both babies in the same playpen, which is something that Denise would never do because the older boy was a little bit rambunctious and hadn't learned how to be gentle, and they tended to not leave him alone where he could smack around his little brother.
Yeah.
So the fact they were both in the same playpen was very odd, and plus, her purse had been dumped out. and with the contents, kind of sloppily spilled out. So he knew something was wrong right away.
Right.
Yeah, all books have their own personalities when you research them, and in this one, I had a pretty good luck. Just about everybody I wanted to talk to offered their part of the story, but it turned out to be a person who didn't want to be interviewed that gave me perhaps the most profound message. There was one veteran police officer who turned me down, not because he didn't want to be helpful, but because of something that seemed to me resembled post-traumatic stress.
Okay.
He said that during his time as a cop, only 2 cases had gotten under his skin. The first unnatural death he ever saw, which was a suicide by hanging that he investigated when he was a rookie, and this case. He just didn't want to relive it again. He got nightmares. His hands started shaking just thinking about it. And he told me that for weeks, every time he closed his eyes, he saw the room in Michael King's house where Denise Lee was, repeatedly attacked.
Yeah.
And we'll describe that more later. It wasn't the creepiness that got to him, but it was the evil he felt in that room. He didn't say so, but I think there was something else as well. Not only was what happened to Denise Lee disgusting and tragic, and her murderer evil to the core, but there was a sense of a wasted opportunity, that this was a murder that could have been prevented.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, the thing, it's unbelievable. I want to make one quick correction of your introduction. Denise was only managed to call 911 once. It says it on the back of the book, but that's an error.
Yeah, that's right.
There were 5 911 calls made to law enforcement between the time Denise Lee was abducted and when she was murdered. One call came from her, and another came from a witness who could report the location of the kidnapper's car as it drove through Northport in real time. The amount of info police had was incredible. If you want me to, I'll run through the 911 calls for you.
Absolutely.
Because, the first one is from Nate Lee, the husband, and he reports that she's missing, but that's almost, it's almost a moot point because Rick Goff has already called for the dogs and the helicopters. The second call is from Denise. She has managed to 6:15 in the evening, and I have to admit that although I've read the transcript of this call many times, I've only been able to actually listen to it once. It's the most horrifying thing I've ever heard.
Wow.
Panicky screams and cries of a woman who's just been repeatedly raped and sodomized and who was now on her way to a secluded spot where she was to be killed. She just heard her abductor borrow a shovel from his cousin, and she knew what that shovel was for. He was going to bury her. And while in the back seat of the guy's Camaro, she managed to steal his cell phone and call 911. So she's in the back seat, and he's driving. And in the back seat with her is the shovel and also the other things he had borrowed, a can of gasoline and a flashlight. So she's got a good idea what's in store for her.
Sure.
Now, the 911 system down there won no awards that day, but in this case, the operator did a really good job. The operator quickly figured out what the situation was. She was reporting her own, Denise was reporting her own abduction, and her abductor was nearby and didn't know. She could hear the operator could hear the kidnapper's voice in the background, and the operator was careful in forming her questions, and Denise was brilliant in giving her answers, so that her abductor didn't realize she was having 2 conversations at once. I'll give you a couple examples. Denise said, "My name is Denise. I'm married to a beautiful husband, and I just want to see my kids again." That was after the operator asked her for her name. When the operator asks where she lives, Denise says, "Please take me back to my house on Latour Avenue." It's the name of the street.
Yeah.
At one point, the kidnapper asks her where his phone is, while simultaneously the operator asks her if she knows this guy, and she says, I don't have it. So she answered both questions. Then the operator could hear the man's voice yell in anger at the woman as he realized that she did have a cell phone, and the call ends abruptly. That's the most terrifying part when the call ends, because you realize, that's it.
Yeah.
The key thing Denise did was she managed to keep the 911 operator on the phone for more than 6 minutes.
Incredible.
Plenty of time for the cops to trace the call and learn that it was coming from the cell phone of Michael King. And minutes later, a motor vehicle data search shows that King drove a green Chevy Camaro precisely the make of car that Jennifer Eckert had seen behaving suspiciously hours earlier. And a couple minutes later, 911 is called again. And this time there's a young woman. She identifies herself as Sabrina Muxlow. She told the operator that she'd just gotten a call from her father, who reported that their cousin, Michael King, had a girl tied up in his car, and she said King had visited her father, borrowed a gas can, a shovel, and a third item she didn't recall. The operator asked the woman what her father's name was, and she said her father didn't want to get involved and wanted to remain anonymous. Well, they were pretty sure his last name was Muxlow. The operator asked how did she know there was a woman in the car, and Sabrina said the woman had tried to escape, but King had pushed her back into the car. Now, the fourth 911 call, was the most important and the one that was handled the worst. If you had to pick a precise moment when law enforcement failed to save Denise's life, it would be sometime during this 911 call. Certainly. It came only 7 minutes after Sabrina Muxlow's call, and it came from a woman named Jane Kowalski, who said that she was driving through Northport. She was talking as she was driving. She was on her way to visit her grandmother, and she was seeing and hearing something that disturbed her. There was a man in a dark Camaro driving behind her, and he had a terrified child in his car. Jane had heard the child scream for help and saw a little hand pounding on the window. Jane was able to tell the operator in real time where the car was, and she continued to give the operator a running account of the Camaro's location until the car made an unexpected left turn and Jane lost it. Now, at that very moment, Michael King's driving his car. He's driving right past a police car that was stopped at the intersection. Yeah. But because of mixed communications in the 911 system and because there was a change of shifts at that very moment, this incredibly urgent message did not go out to police cars on the road until many minutes later, and the opportunity was lost. The operator stayed on the line with Jane Kowalski and made sure she was safe. Are your windows rolled up? The operator asked. She told Jane to pull over and wait for a police car to come and take her story. While more time was lost as the operator tried to nail down in which parking lot Jane had parked, and the call ended, Jane waited and waited, but no cop car ever showed up. Jane called 911 a second time, but the shift had changed. The operator had no idea who she was, and she had to start all over. No cop car ever appeared in the parking lot where she pulled over. So eventually, hoping that her eyes and her ears had been deceiving her, she continued on her way to Fort Myers to visit her grandmother. But here's one to put in your what are the odds category. Yeah. Jane Kowalski, the woman who called in, was a computer expert and had worked on a computer-aided dispatch system for 911 calls.
Incredible.
So she knew exactly the information the operator needed and was giving it to her in clear and concise manner, and she was giving the info in the correct order so that it could be most easily entered into the computer system. Jeez. Still, the operator got it wrong. Now, since then, Jane Kowalski has given thousands of interviews, and she always says the same thing. I was giving her exact locations. How could they mess it up? But they had. It took some doing, but Kowalski did convince the police that she was an important witness, and she picked out King from a lineup at the police station, and months later was an effective witness for the prosecution at King's murder trial. Right. Which brings us to 911 call number 4. It's about 10 minutes to 7 in the evening, and this call did not come from somebody with Jane Kowalski's communication skills. It came from Harold Muxlow, the father of Sabrina, who had called earlier. And he managed to spit out that although he was not exactly sure of the nature of the emergency, he knew that there was somebody that don't want to be where they need to be. And they were in a green 95 Camaro in Northport someplace. He said he knew this because the man had stopped by his house with a girl in the car to borrow a shovel, a gas can, and a flashlight. Muxlow asked the man why he needed the items, and King said his lawnmower had broken down. Now, while Muxlow was giving the man the items, he saw a girl get out of the car. She was tied up in some fashion and trying to escape. And the woman said to Muxlow, "Call the cops." So Muxlow asked the man, "Hey, what's this all about?" And the guy said, "Don't worry about it." The operator asked for the man's identity, and Muxlow said he didn't know the guy's name. Well, they knew from the previous call that they were cousins. Now, Muxlow's attempt to keep himself and King anonymous was in vain. Police listening to the tape of Denise's 911 call heard the man in the background refer to his cousin Harold. Turned out King only had one cousin named Harold, and that was Harold Muxlow, and he lived in Northport. Bingo. Muxlow made his call from a payphone, so his ID would be protected, but by the time he got home, police were there waiting for him. And the fifth call was from a guy named Sean Johnson. And he, like Jane Kowalski, was in traffic while King was driving Denise Lee, and she was making a fuss in the back seat. But unlike Jane, Sean didn't call 911 right away. He had to think about it. And it wasn't until he got home that he realized maybe he should report what he had heard. And he said he heard screams for help and someone pounding on the window in panic. So there was 5 911 calls, and by the time police discovered Mike King driving his Camaro, there was blood spatter on the car, the shovel in the back seat was wet, his shoes were sandy, and his jeans were soaking wet, and Denise Lee was nowhere to be seen. So that brings us to the discovery of the rape dungeon and the murderer's arrest.
This is about 6 hours later that finally he's pulled over, and this is after he's already disposed of Denise Amber Lee in a shallow grave.
Yeah. Well, first, police go to King's house. They get there just before 7 o'clock, this is hours earlier. And fearing that she's in there being harmed, they bust in. The house has no furniture, and both the TV set in the living room and the radio in one of the bedrooms have been turned up full volume. And in that bedroom, a blanket had been taped over the window. And this is the scene that gave the cop the shakes.
Sure.
A blanket had been taped over the window. There was blood and semen stains on the rug. And throughout the house, investigators discovered pieces of duct tape with long blonde hairs clinging to them.
Wow.
A full-length mirror that had been mounted to the living room wall had been removed and leaned against the bedroom wall, positioned so that the rapist could watch himself as he assaulted his victim. There was also a blanket that had blood stains on it. The whole house was declared a crime scene and sealed off. The arrest is, life can be stranger than fiction. One of the more compelling characters in a Killer's Touch, I'll get the title of my book right, A Killer's Touch, is State Trooper Eddie Pope. He was the arresting officer. And if he'd had to bet ahead of time who would make the arrest, Pope would have been an odds-on favorite. He was smart, and he was lucky, and by always positioning himself in the best spot, he was often in on big busts. And he was the first to help during emergencies. He'd been named Trooper of the Month so often, 4 times, that he'd been also named Trooper of the Year and asked to throw out the first pitch at Tampa Bay Rays baseball game. And that was before this case. So it was only to be expected that it was Pope who spotted the Camaro on the expressway and pulled him over and made the arrest. Pope saw the spatter on the car and noticed that it was still wet. Now, because of that, he knew Denise could not be far away. If she was too far away, the spatter would have either dried or flown off the car. And, of course, Pope's heart sunk because he knew what the spatter meant. He knew that the chances of finding Denise still alive were no longer very good.
Sure.
But he also realized just what a genius Denise was. In addition to her 911 call, which showed quick thinking in a moment of ultimate stress, she'd also managed to take her ring off and leave it in the back seat of King's car. She was going to make sure, that this scumbag never hurt anyone ever again. Now, unfortunately, there wasn't much of a search that night. It stopped raining, but with the nighttime came a thickening fog. So the helicopters were forced to land, and everybody got called home. So they waited till the morning to continue the search. And in the meantime, King was brought in and questioned all night. The hope, of course, was that King would immediately tell them where Denise was, but he didn't. He concocted a wild story about picking up a hitchhiker who attacked him, and eventually he and Denise were both hostages. In an inspired move, the troopers put Harold Muxlow, cousin Harold, who'd lent him the shovel, in the room with King and left them alone. Of course, a surveillance camera was running the whole time. Muxlow did a great job of quizzing King. He watched the tape a couple of times, and he really did a good job of trying to get King to mess up his story and be in a position where he had to tell the truth.
Right.
Obviously, when King came to Muxloe's house earlier that evening with Denise in the car, there hadn't been another man who was holding them both hostage. But despite this, no matter how silly and unlikely King's story became, he stuck to it, and the Muxloe experiment didn't work. Muxloe seemed to be searching for King's conscience. He said things like, her parents are going to need relief. They've got to find her body. Otherwise, you've got to live with that. Live with that for a long time. Otherwise, her parents will always be wondering, where's she at? Is she still alive? But King didn't have a conscience to find. Eventually, right. Muxloe was, allowed to leave, and police took up the interrogation. But King did not budge, and instead he lawyered up.
Now, who did represent him at court? What type of experience did this person have? Since we're dealing with Florida in a capital case, how experienced was the lawyer that he was assigned?
Well, he got Jerry Meisner and John Scotese out of the they appointed him his lawyers. He had no money to get his own lawyer.
Sure.
But he also, for the major part of the trial, his defense was in the penalty phase, and for that he got Carolyn Schlemmer, who was a very experienced in capital cases. Her job is basically to get killers life in prison rather than the death penalty, and she fought tooth and nail to do that in this case. Now, I tell you, we talk a little bit about Robert Salvador. I remember him from the book.
Yes.
He was, his story tells us a little something about the nature of the crime. If you start thinking that this was a spur-of-the-moment thing, and perhaps Michael King, he was a time bomb and it went off, not so much. I think it was a lot worse than that. There are signs of premeditation all over the place. This was a scheme, and he carried it out. Right from the abduction to the burial, everything was planned. And we know this because even before the crime spree began, earlier that drizzly day, he'd gone target shooting with his gun. The only time he'd ever been known to go target shooting. He went at the invitation of a coworker named Robert Salvador. Salvador went target shooting all the time, and King told police that King told police about Salvador early during the interrogation, and police knocked on Salvador's door in the middle of the night. So Salvador had no idea that there's a woman missing, knows none of that. Police ask him, have you seen Michael King lately? He says no. Did you go target shooting today? He says no. But his reasons for lying didn't have anything to do with the crime. They were marital. Salvador's wife didn't like King. He was a creepy guy, and she thought her husband spent way too much time and money at the firing range. So this was double reason for Salvador to lie. Salvador claimed he wasn't aware of the seriousness of the crime he was involved in, and he lied just so he wouldn't catch holy hell from his wife.
Right.
And like Harold Muxloe, his realization of the situation came in increments. Hours after police left his house the following morning as the sun was coming up, Salvador hears the news, and he calls the police back and says, I saw King, and we did go target shooting. Salvador said that King had his own 9mm gun, no ammunition. So Salvador gave him some 9 ammo, and police theorized that King pocketed a couple of bullets so that he'd be able to use them in his gun later that day. And Salvador said he certainly had the opportunity to do that, and Salvador passed the lie detector test. So that's premeditation. King had practiced with the handgun. He'd already planned on using it later in the day. He borrowed a shovel. He'd already planning to dig a shallow grave. Now, unfortunately for Salvador, he later became the target of King's defense team. They claimed that, despite any logic or evidence, that Salvador had accompanied King throughout the attack and had, in fact, been the man to shoot Denise through the head. Of course, the jury didn't buy it. Nobody bought it.
What was the other strategies at trial were also about the evidence contamination? Tell us about what else they attempted at trial in their defense.
Well, right. They all of the evidence was pretty, airtight.
Sure.
They had DNA. They had proof that Denise was in his house. They had proof that Denise was in his car. What they didn't have was a gun. So they asked every witness, did you find a gun? No, I didn't find a gun. Did you find the bullet? No, I didn't find a bullet. And they would say, is it possible, all these DNA people, is it possible for the stuff to be contaminated? Unlikely, but yeah, possible. And that was about the extent of it. That's about all they had.
How about the evidence tampering? They said something again.
Well, yeah, that's the implication of, is it possible for it to be contaminated on purpose? Well, yes, but I've never heard anything like that ever happening.
Yeah.
I don't think that the jury thought about it for 2 seconds. Let me tell you a little bit more about the discovery of the body.
Okay.
Trooper Pope had predicted that the body was going to be close to the place where the arrest took place, and apparently Trooper Pope is never wrong. As Denise's body was found less than a mile from the spot where he was apprehended, the shallow grave was discovered in the sandy soil off a desolate road. The road had been built to accommodate a housing development that was never built. Another case where land developers start working before they had buyers, and then there were no buyers. So it was an odd sight. There was a paved road, smooth roads with lines painted on it. There were fire hydrants. There was sidewalks, and yet you were in the middle of nowhere. It was a place where a madman could do his dirty work without worrying about untimely interruptions. The body was discovered by the K-9 team of Tammy Treadway and her dog, Siku. I had a really nice interview with Tammy Treadway. She's a lovely woman, and she loves her dog. There were blood spots in the sand, and the CSI people were called in, and the spot was excavated by forensic archaeologists an inch at a time until the remains of Denise Lee were unearthed. She was naked and shot once through the right temple. There were bruises in the shape of handprints on her body. She'd been brutally and multiply penetrated, and DNA results indicated her attacker was Michael King. Because she was the daughter of a well-known and liked cop, her funeral was huge. On the trip from the church to the cemetery, rose petals were sprinkled in the road. Fire trucks led the way, their lights going around. Spectators lined the road and saluted as the hearse carrying Denise's coffin drove by. Elementary schools emptied so students could stand outside and watch. It was a big deal. I don't think that there's going to be anything like that on the day that they kill Michael King.
No. Tell us a little bit about her father through this whole thing, because we haven't spoke too much. Obviously, he's a detective. He's distraught.
Yeah.
He works at the same Charlotte County, ironically, at the same sheriff's department that mishandled the 911 calls. Not that they are so involved with those calls themselves, but still, ironically, he works at that county sheriff's office.
He always says we screwed up. He doesn't distance himself from the error at all. It was a department error, and he's part of the department, so it was our error. He's a rock. All of my dealing with the family was with him. He's the spokesperson. He's the man. He's the guy at the point. And if you want to talk to somebody from Denise's family, you talk to Rick.
Right.
And Rick, it's hard to compare, because Nate didn't handle it nearly as well as Rick did, and nobody possibly could. I've noticed this in other cases where there are professionals who are used to dealing with very difficult scenes and subjects. They have a place in their brain where they go.
Right.
I once covered a case where a physician had lost his family to a home invasion, and when he talked about the case, he talked about it as a doctor would. And Rick talks about this case as a cop would.
Right.
I try to get him to talk about it as a dad would, and it doesn't happen.
Right.
He's not going to share that part. In the meantime, Nate has turned this into kind of a cause.
Right.
He has formed the Denise Amber Lee Foundation, and they want to revamp 911 systems, everywhere. On April 24th, 2008, the Florida legislature unanimously passed the Denise Amber Lee Act, which provided for voluntary training for all 911 operators, and that was a step in the right direction. But they weren't satisfied. They want mandatory training and certification for all 911 personnel. I hate to say anything disparaging about the Denise Amber Lee Foundation, but they're trying to make a universal issue out of what is largely a local one. People
explain that. Why?
Okay. I live in Brooklyn, New York. If I call 911, in 5 minutes I will have a fire truck, an ambulance, and a police car out in front of my house, just in case. 911 systems in most places are just, they're very efficient. They're great. And because this one operator screwed this up, to try to make it a national deal, 911 systems are inadequate and they need to be better, is a little bit of a stretch. Which isn't to say that he's not a great guy and he's trying to do what's right in his mind. But I think that maybe a victims advocacy foundation would be better. I don't know. That's enough on that. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out why Michael King did what he did. I think with most criminals we see obvious foreshadowing, harbingers of things to come. A slow deterioration of civilized behavior until boom, they snap and they turn into a psycho killer.
Right.
But with Michael King, not so much. I think you could have talked to him the day before it happened, and you would have said, well, he's not the brightest guy in the world, but he's okay guy. So maybe there's something in his history of dating that triggered this. So I put together little short sketches of the women we know from his past to see if we can find clues that might, and you tell me, and your listeners, I would love to hear their feedback as well. But, I'll start with Danielle. She was King's wife. And that's, as far as we don't know about anything about his dating career before her. She was his wife and the mother of his son, who was an adolescent when this happened. We get an inkling of what sort of person she was by the fact that a judge awarded King custody of their boy. Danielle had met a new man through the internet and took off. At the time of the murder, King said he talked to her maybe once or twice a year at the most. So, okay, he might have some hostility towards women over that.
Sure.
Next, we have a woman who in the book I call Amy Sue. Probably the most bizarre relationship that he had with a woman. He met her on a phone sex chat line, and she told him that she was 15 years old, although she was actually 25. She later said how he thought I was really 15, I don't know. I had a 5-year-old son. He must have figured it out, but he didn't figure it out. She said she lived in, it was back on the phone sex chat line. She said she lives in Tennessee and was looking to get away and have an adventure. She said she was 5'2", weighed just 100 pounds, and had blonde hair. Just what he liked. So King drove to Tennessee and picked her up and brought her back to his house in Northport. She was stuck in the house with no place to go, nothing to do. She later said he was very controlling. She was allowed to do things, go shopping or go for walks only when she was with him. She tried to run away a few times, but he caught her and brought her back. Since she was a drug addict, he bought her drugs and that kept her home and content for a while. And when she ran away, he would just offer her drugs, and she said, "Oh, okay, I'll come back." One time she got a member of her family to call King and remind him that she was only 15 and needed to be home or else. And that did the trick for a while. She agreed to come back at one point if he bought her a car, which he did. And as soon as she got the car, she used it to drive back to Tennessee, and he reported the car stolen. So it's a mess. Amy Sue said that she only talked to him once after the stolen car incident. She called him from Tennessee to say that she was pregnant and the child was his. and then, attempt to extort more money out of him. And after the conversation, she said he changed his phone number. During his time with Amy Sue, King was a regular at a beauty parlor where he had blonde highlights put in his hair and had his body waxed, a full Brazilian, you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
he didn't like body hair. The owner of the parlor said that one time King came in with a little blonde, bragged that she was only 15 years old, and made out with her right there in the beauty parlor in front of everyone.
Why not? Yeah.
Okay, so now that was by far the weirdest example. His next girlfriend's a woman named Jennifer, and she's tiny blonde, weighs about 100 pounds, and she was the reason that King didn't have any furniture in his house. She took it, and it was at her house in Homosassa. It's a town in Florida, maybe 20 miles north of Northport. And they had lived together at her place for a while. She had a couple of kids about the same age as King's son, and they went on a few vacations all together, like the Brady Bunch. She told police that King wanted to experiment sexually, but she wasn't into it. She had rules, no toys, and nothing that wasn't natural. Jennifer said that before they moved to her house, they tried to live together in his, but King didn't want her to work, so she stayed home and cleaned, and she didn't even have the opportunity to call her parents. She had her cell phone with her, but not her charger. King managed to cut her off from the rest of her life for a time, and it took her a long time to get a semblance of control back. She grabbed her kids and hightailed it back to her own home. He visited her there frequently and eventually moved in with her, and he took his stuff with him. And when he was kicked out of there, after money disappeared at the store run by Jennifer's dad, he left without his furniture. And his time with Jennifer overlapped with his next and final girlfriend, who was named Tennille. Tennille seemed very regular. I mean, she seemed like a little sweetheart. Also not so bright, but it seemed like an attempt by Michael King to find a good woman, not a woman who was going to do kinky sex with him or who was 15 years old or any of that, but a good companion. And he met her because she played bingo with his mom. And she told police that in the days before the murder, King had filed for bankruptcy and had hopes that he was going to be able to keep his house. She had no idea that there was a brutal sex crime in him. She said a typical date with him was going to Applebee's, shopping at Walmart. They liked to cuddle up together and watch movies. Said sex with King was frequent but not unusual. Sure, oral, but no bondage. No role playing. They'd had sex twice during the previous week before the attack on Denise. So he wasn't. He should have been satiated to a certain extent. And he didn't use a condom, but that was okay because she had her tubes tied and was also on the pill just to be sure.
Oh.
Now the last member of our rogues gallery of King's women is a woman I call Stephanie in the book. And Stephanie, it'll be unfair to call her a girlfriend. She was even tinier than the other. She's 4'10", and she demonstrates the lengths to which King would scheme in order to have sex. She was a drinker and the wife of one of King's co-workers. He did repeated favors for this guy who was down and out and needed work just to have excuses to get near his wife. And when he was alone with the woman, he told her what a bad guy her husband was.
Oh.
We see, he's a schemer. One day, he takes Stephanie to his house, and his son and his parents are in the living room. He puts Stephanie in his bedroom and gives her a couple six-packs of beer, knowing that she'll drink it because she's a drinker. She drinks it, she falls asleep, and when she wakes up, she's on her stomach on the bed, her pants are down, and King is raping her. She just called her husband and told him to come and pick her up. And when police talked to her after the murder, she recalled hearing King and some of his friends talking about the underage girls they'd had sex with, a conversation that she said creeped her out. So, yikes.
Yeah, there's a lot of the characteristics of some of these other killers.
So you see little bits and pieces of it.
Yeah.
And it all comes together in one act of madness at the end, of cruelty, unbelievable cruelty. But there seems to be a strong component of pedophilia.
Mm-hmm.
You know, any guy whose girlfriends are all that diminutive, and the one that he seems proudest of is the one who's lying and saying she's just 15.
Yeah.
That would seem to be the thing. And, of course, Denise is only 21. She looks, you know, she could have been 15. She's a very young-looking woman. Yeah. So, yes, you wanted to talk about the trial more. Obviously, the dramatic highlight of the trial is Denise's 911 tape.
Sure.
The prosecution read a transcript of the tape during the opening arguments, but it was the playing of the tape itself that was the emotional peak at the trial. Friends and loved ones were alerted ahead of time that the tape was going to be played, so they would have an opportunity to step out in the hall if they wanted to.
Did they?
Hard to, yeah, the women did. Rick and Nate both stayed. It's hard to describe the effects the tape had on people. It's traumatizing. Like I said, I listened to it once. I said, okay, I got it. I never have to listen to that again.
Yeah.
The amazing thing is, Rick and Nate stay. Rick rocks rhythmically and shudders. He looks like he's working to stay inside his skin, and Nate remains perfectly still, which is a little bit of a opposite of what I would have expected.
Yeah.
But Nate just kind of closes his eyes and goes into a very still place. And Rick, I'm sure he's just, every ounce of his energy is not attacking the guy sitting at the defendant's table. They both heard the tape before, I should note. Rick heard it only minutes after it was recorded. He was the one who ID'd the voices on the tape as that of Denise. And Nate listened to it once before just so that he wouldn't be hearing it for the first time in court.
Right.
So that might explain why he took it so well, because we have no idea how he reacted the first time.
Yeah.
It's common for defendants. I'm sure you hear this all the time. Defendants at long murder trials always seem suspiciously sedate.
Yeah.
They sit at the defense table and they don't move. It's long been suspected that defense attorneys drug their clients to keep them from behaving in a way that might turn the jury against them.
Sure.
You don't want them reacting to things, especially, angrily. And that was true in this case to the extreme. King seemed so catatonic during the proceedings, he would sometimes go the entire court day moving nothing but his eyes, and they would flick about the courtroom. He wouldn't turn his head, but he looked from side to side and up and down.
Wow.
Very odd. Judge Economou had his fill of this after a while, and he stopped proceedings. He said, we're not going to have any more testimony until somebody examines this guy and tells me that he still knows what's going on here.
Wow.
So they had the shrinks ask him the questions. What are the rules of the court? Why are you here? What role does this guy play? What role does that guy play? He got all the answers right, and the trial went on. Now, as I said before, the defense came in two stages. At first, they argued that King was innocent, not of the abduction and the rape. There was no, that had been pretty much proven. But because there was no gun, they argued that the murder had been committed by Rob Salvador.
Right.
It wasn't until after the jury had found King guilty of murder, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, and during the penalty phase of the trial, that the defense tried to argue that King was legally insane at the time he ended Denise's life. I don't know if you remember, last time I was on with you, we talked about the Stephen Stanko,
right,
who in the book Watch Mommy Die. And there was a Dr. Wu who testified that Stanko was not guilty by reason of insanity due to brain damage. And to prove this, he brought out PET scans, stood for positron emission tomography. And the doctor claimed that he could make pictures in which you could see insanity. That is, you could see that the patient's frontal lobes weren't firing on all cylinders, and thus the patient had no impulse control.
Right.
In that case, the Stanko case, the claim was that Stanko had been hit in the head with a Coke bottle as a teenager, and in this case, it was a sledding accident. But, whatever. Yeah. Dr. Wu does this all the time, and he gives remarkably similar testimony in every case. Sure. And he's never been successful in a criminal case, but he did once help someone win a civil case with his PET scans. They got his brothers to testify after showing the pictures of King's brain with the frontal lobes not firing properly. They got King's brothers to testify that when he was a boy, he was riding on a sled being pulled by a snowmobile being driven by his older brother, and they were going 80 miles an hour, and when the brother made a turn, Mike swung, and his head hit a shed or a pole, depending on which family member you believed. Now, the family members couldn't corroborate the claim that with any medical paperwork, and experts say that a head hitting a pole at that speed would smash like a pumpkin. Prosecutor Karen Fraveleg said that kind of impact would have turned King's head into applesauce.
Applesauce.
Yes. So now, interestingly, King's mother didn't testify at the trial because she'd earlier been asked that the prosecutor, Lon Arendt, had as many of the family members interviewed as right after the arrest as he could get a hold of, and they asked King's mom if he'd ever suffered any head injuries, and she'd said no. So if she wanted to testify to the sledding injury at the trial, she was going to have to explain that answer, and they didn't put her on the stand.
Yeah.
The defendant's brothers also took turns talking about several incidents in Mike's life in which his damaged brain had caused him to act in a dangerous trance, kind of a fugue state. Most memorable of these was once when Mike King watched the movie The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then imitating the movie, ran around the house wielding a gas-operated chainsaw, scaring everyone and filling the house with exhaust. And there was another time when he was imitating Elmer Fudd from a Bugs Bunny cartoon and used an actual bow to fire an actual arrow at his brother so hard that the arrow went right through a door. Now, the brothers all agreed that Mike King had been having nosebleeds and ringing in his ears ever since his brain injury. And King's girlfriend, Jennifer, was called to the stand to describe how his behavioral problems, paranoia and the like, had grown worse during the months leading up to his attack on Denise. But on September 4th, 2009, after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty for Michael King.
Right. And he awaits his execution?
He awaits the Valium needle.
And Florida does execute fairly soon compared to other states, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, it's never soon, but
no.
Yeah, they do eventually get around to it. Yes.
Yeah.
The average wait, I think, is 6 years.
Yeah.
Now, one more thing about Harold Muxlow. When he testified during the trial, there were people. I mean, I know that Denise's family just thinks he's evil. That he should have. All he had to do was call right away, and he would have saved her life. And I'm not so sure.
No.
For one thing, I've seen his attempt to get Michael King to confess, which seemed heartfelt. But the other thing was, there's a very good argument that Muxlow's stupid. And he came, not only that, but he came from a culture, a segment of society in which no one ever calls the cops ever for any reason,
right.
Especially if on his cousin, on family. The light bulb over his head went on just a little bit at a time. When he called his daughter and asked what he should do, he thought about what his cousin had said. And he needed the can of gas, the shovel, and the flashlight for his riding mower that had broken down. So the first thing he does is he gets in his car and he goes over to Mike King's house and to see if there's a broken down riding mower on the lawn. The story might be true, he's still thinking. Jeez. And it's only after he sees that there is no riding mower that he goes to the payphone and calls 911. Now, he's not completely innocent. Obviously, he was looking to protect his own butt as well. He
Sure.
didn't give his name when he called. But we do know that, Michael King might not have had a conscience, but Harold Muxlow did.
Yeah.
As Muxlow was describing for police, his realization, when he first realizes he could have saved that woman but didn't, he burst into tears.
Yeah.
But that's not an evil man. That's just a man who was slow on the uptake.
Yeah. He might have been slow to react, but he seemed genuine in his, again, like you say, his remorse, and his effort to help police seems sincere by the account in the book, for sure.
Yeah. Well, my next book, coming up in a few months, is going to be called A Knife in the Heart. It's about the world of juvenile delinquency, again down in Florida. Juvenile delinquents who are addicted to painkillers and act out in sometimes brutally violent fashion. In this case, it's two girls involved in a love triangle who use the social media to amp up the rhetoric of their dispute. In the old days, disputes between teenage girls were given a chance to cool down if you could separate them. But now with Facebook and MySpace and that kind of thing, they can amp it back. They can, 24 hours of just needling each other, and because it's a social media, it's all in public. And the story takes a tragic turn when one of them brings a knife to the fist fight. One girl stabbed to death, and the other, who's far smaller than the victim, claimed she was jumped and had a right to defend herself with a weapon. And in the meantime, the young man who was the subject of their love, is a pretty boy and a complete piece of crap. So that's the next book.
What is a juvenile? Just for our audience, I know in Canada here, 18 is an adult, and they do have some provision that they could raise up to adult court at 16. What are the laws in Florida? What do they consider a juvenile? And is there any?
It's the same. It's 18. The smaller of the two girls was a couple of years older than that. She was an adult. The victim was a high school girl.
Right.
Now these days I'm doing something not completely different, but quite different from what I've been doing. I don't even know if this is going to end up being a book or not. But I'm investigating an unsolved cold case that took place in my neighborhood, south of Rochester, New York, when I was growing up. Two teenage girls who were friends of mine, Georgianne Formicola and Catherine Ann Bernhardt, disappeared on the first weekend of summer vacation in 1966 while swimming in a creek that ran behind my house next to an old stone trestle. Their bodies were found a month later, brutally murdered with a knife in bushes next to railroad tracks. They disappeared on one side of my house and were found on the other. So I grew up knowing that the boogeyman had crossed my back field one night. Makes it kind of hard to sleep. And maybe a reason why I've ended up doing what I do for a living, too. I think that probably...
I was going to ask that.
I was going to ask
that obvious question. It's you're not the first true crime writer as well. I mean, not that it's not unique, but Ron Francel wrote Darkest Night, same sort of situation where he personally knew the victims of this crime and wrote about it and was quite successful.
Well, Ann Rule starts her... Well, I guess she's already writing for True Detective magazines when she meets Bundy, but she invented the true crime genre pretty much because she was a campaign worker sitting next to Ted Bundy.
Well, she was it was a crisis hotline. It was a crisis.
Right, yeah, that's right, for suicides and things.
Yeah,
last summer, one of the victims' mothers, who's a friend of my mom, asked me to do a fresh investigation because I'm a true crime writer, and she couldn't afford a detective, and the police have stopped thinking about it many years ago, to see if I could figure out what happened. Also, she said she thought everyone had forgotten about the girls way too soon, and she wanted me to help people remember her daughter, Kathy Bernhardt. So I've been talking to everyone I can find who might know something, and learned just last week that the Monroe County Sheriff's Office is going to release their files to me, despite the fact that it's technically an open case. I convinced them that we have an 86-year-old woman here who needs closure. Let's declare this historical and make it public. So we're making progress there.
Well, congratulations, and that's quite flattering, too, for someone to come to you after all these books that you've penned and to ask your help in such a official police sort of manner, basically.
Oh, it sure was. Yeah, I explained to her right away. I'm not a detective. I am not a cop. But when I promise that I'm going to help, I'm going to do everything I can possibly do to help, and I'm not going to give up.
Well, I think your journalism acts the same way. Your sense of investigation. Every one of your books is so comprehensive and thorough that I think you'll have a lot of success with this and do this case justice for sure. Certainly.
Well, thanks, Dan. I sure hope so.
Yeah. Well, it's been an exciting hour, Michael. Thank you very much once again for gracing my program, True Murder, and talking about.
Hey, Dan, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much. Well, you take care, Michael, and we'll be in touch very shortly because you're a very prolific writer, and I wanted to hear A Knife in the Hunt and your next cold case. So we'll be talking to you soon, I'm sure.
Very good, Dan. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Michael. Good night. You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors have written about them. Good night.